Hey everyone, this is a quick instructional video on the chapter Genealogy of Place in Tim Cresswell's Introduction to Place for the Learning in Place seminar at EKU Honors. So let's start out by kind of thinking about what kind of thing is place, or how do we conceptualize place? Cresswell talks about kind of these points in terms of conceptualizing place. Definitely from a geographical perspective, defining what exists. What do you see in place? If you think about where you are right now in place and you scan and look around, what exists in that place? And then the epistemology and metaphysics of place, ways of seeing and knowing about place. And then finally, place as interdisciplinary, or place studies as interdisciplinary. And you definitely see this. Literary studies has a whole theory of place kind of segment that probably developed somewhat from environmental studies or eco-criticism, but also you see this across other disciplines in social sciences. And Cresswell warns us that we should continue to acknowledge the disciplinarity in place, right, with geography, but then we should also think about those interdisciplinary connections. So we shouldn't get rid of one to focus on the other, but to think of them all holistically. So let's talk about how Cresswell discusses approaching concepts of place through geographic and interdisciplinary theories. And he really looks at this through three different approaches: descriptive, humanist, and phenomenology. And before I go there, I just want to back up and talk about theory in general. When I talk about theory and literary criticism, I like to use this metaphor. How many of you have glasses or have had an eye appointment before where you've been fitted for glasses? They put that machine kind of over your face and they move between different lenses. They say, the doctor will say, can you see better from this lens? Can you see better from this lens? And you try to get an image that you're looking at in front of you as clear as possible. This is how I kind of think about theory. Each theoretical approach is a lens or a way of seeing, a way of making meaning from a text, from observations, from studies. It is not necessarily the only way to look at it. And in fact, a combination of theoretical approaches is often the best way to see, just like you won't necessarily have the same prescription in your right eye as in your left eye in order to be able to see clearly if you wear glasses. So think about that metaphor as we think about theoretical approaches in concepts of place. So here's the first theoretical underpinning of descriptive approaches. Descriptive approaches, according to Cresswell, are interested in the distinctiveness and particularity of places. He talks about chora, the study of regions, and topography, which comes from Aristotle and place. So think about maps and how maps display place, how maps engage with and interact with place. And when I'm thinking about maps here, I'm going way back to like paper maps, maps that you can spread out on the floor, large maps, and kind of look at regions and places, try to think about directions. How would you get from place A to place B? And also topography. What does the landscape look like in that place? Am I going to be traveling over mountains? Am I going to be traveling over really flat land? What will that look like, and how will that change my concept of that journey? The other bit with descriptive approaches is environmental determinism. Environmental factors affect human character and also how we integrate with place. And this also plays into the next approach that we're going to talk about in a minute, and humanist geography. So kind of hold on to that, because like with any theory, it's very difficult to isolate all of the aspects of one theory. There's often interlaps or overlaps between them, or interrelationships between them. The next kind of vocabulary word or concept, if you will, is Dasein, and this is from Heidegger, and it's that place is central to human existence, and relationships between people and places are affirmed by dwelling, or where you live, or your place ballet that we talked about in the first chapter. In other words, we build place, and concepts of place invoke a sense of nearness and care. Casey argues that place is primary. It precedes space rather than merely being located in it. And take a moment to look on page 28 and 29 and read Wallace Stevens' poems, Anecdote of the Jar, which really is a good illustration for how place is primary. Then also we could think about how wilderness becomes place, and I know I've talked with y'all a little bit about this in class and the development of wilderness in America in particular. I mentioned to a group of students recently that Roderick Nash talks about how wilderness early on, concepts of American wilderness, was a place to be conquered, a place to be feared, an unknown place in the early settlements and colonizing of the United States and of America, Northern America in particular. But when you think about over time this trajectory into the 20th century, we ended up beginning to have conservation efforts, because as the Industrial Revolution was changing the landscape, and as our culture's reliance on the landscape was changing, wilderness and our concepts or our approaches to wilderness changed. And so how would we describe wilderness in the past? As a place that's fearful, that needs to be conquered, both its people and its landscape, in order to survive, becomes a place that needs to be protected so that it can survive, that needs to be part of a conservation effort. And so this is why we get in the early 20th century land that's set aside for parks and recreation, and just thinking about the importance of landscape and wilderness in a different way. Another kind of reference here is Bachelard's Poetics of Space, which was written in 1994. And he argues that memory appears about time, but it's also about space. The Poetics of Space focus specifically on home, but we'll see in the next approach to geography and to understanding place, we'll see in that next approach that Gillian Rose argues and pushes back against this home, that home doesn't mean everything to everyone. And then finally, Saber and Vidal argue that culture transforms our natural environment. And this all leads us into then the social construction of place that comes with humanist geographers. They're particularly interested in the peculiarity of places in relationship to social processes. A lot of this develops in the 1980s, developed from theories in Marxism, feminist theories, and post-structuralist theories. It's founded on acts of exclusion or tensions between the fixed and the mobile investments in place. Think about how transitory many places are now. When I lived in Tampa, Florida, people were moving in and out of that space all of the time. Moving here to Richmond, Kentucky, there's a lot less of that movement, but mobility is still in place, right? If you live in Richmond, Kentucky, and you want to go to Target, it's a 20-30 minute drive. It's not that far. We have this mobile investment. Our understanding of place and region is more expansive than it used to be. Also, humanist geographers are concerned about this relationship between meaning, place, and power. And Cresswell writes another book that's completely devoted to this, called In Place, Out of Place. But essentially, that how we make meaning in place is also related to power and to power structures. And so just kind of think about those relationships. Another thing to think about is our relationship between place and identity as we think about social constructions of place. It is a socio-political space. When we only read one of the poems from Appalachian Elegy in week 1, but you can go back into week 1 and read a few more from Bell Hooks, because some of the other examples really talk about this relationship between place and identity, and also between place meaning and power structures in a familiar place that is her home. Gillian Rose, and I had already referenced this in the last slide, talks about that conceptions of home and place are not equivalent among historically marginalized groups of people. In the search for essence, difference has no place. And so there's that tension there, right? Because a concept of home to one group is making assumptions about the concept of home, the safety, the safe space of home to another group. Malpass, another philosopher in geography, argues that place drives social construction. So he's really looking at it from that point of view, and definitely a humanist geographer. But Sack disagrees that place is a social construction and views it as just being in the world. Place brings the social, the natural, and the cultural together. It produces them. So to Sack's point, if place is just a social construction alone, then it doesn't encompass the natural. It doesn't encompass that descriptive or topography that we talked about in the earlier slide. The final theoretical underpinning I want to talk about is phenomenological approaches. These include both humanist and non-humanist geographers. They're interested in defining the essence of human existence as one that is necessarily and importantly in place, while being less interested in a place's unique attributes or the social forces involved with the construction of place. Phenomenology is essentially a philosophical approach that concentrates on the study of consciousness and the objects of direct experience. Geographical place in this instance being that experience, and how we interact with geographical place. If place is the essence of human experience, then Casey argues that it's a process of gathering, and that there's a relationship between the inside of a place, which gathers, and an outside from where things are gathered. And Ralph and Tuan also respond to the spatial mathematics theories of place as just being empty or space. Location is not necessarily a condition of place. Instead, it determines experience. And I want to unpack that last statement in just a second to say that where we are located is not necessarily how we conceive place. There's this kind of tension between geographic location and our understanding or our connections to or our preconceptions that we bring to a place. So here's just a list of further resources that are hyperlinked that might help you. There's a video, a podcast, and a website with multiple sources and resources. Just some other kind of things to think about if you're struggling with this concept and the genealogy of place. And I should have mentioned earlier in the slide that genealogy of place here is really meant, if we think about if you've written for a paper before, a review of literature, this chapter is really all about reviewing the literature in terms of different approaches to our conceptions of place. And so here's your application challenge. I'd like you to select one of those theoretical approaches, either the descriptive, the social construction, or the phenomenological approach to place, and I'd like you to apply it to your assigned reading from Jhumpa Lahiri's Whereabouts. As you work through this process, also consider the connections between all three approaches, as we discussed in Cresswell's Genealogy of Place. And there is actually, I can't get to that right at the moment here in my mind, but there is a page, it's one of the last few pages of this chapter that kind of breaks down the connections between and the differences between these approaches to thinking about place. I look forward to having further of these discussions in person soon, and feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions. We'll see you soon.